Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler, still searching for what to call my live stream. It's called Man on a Mission these days, but maybe I'll talk with you sometime about some of the possible other ways to go. I have a better human story that I'm on a mission to convey. It's a way of understanding what's happened to our species, and even more locally, what's the crisis in America today, in ways that put things in an importantly different light, that we understand who we are as creatures differently if you see it the way I'm wanting to present it to you. And you see also our history and the situation we find ourselves in now in a different light. And it brings into clearer focus what is the nature of the challenge that we face as a species, the civilization creating species that either has got to get its act together to be able to survive for the long haul, or it's going to inevitably destroy itself, failing that. So that's what I'm here for. And I want to start out by saying that there's these are some of the topics, and the main event there I'm going to get to is called the discernible reality of a force of evil. This is the third big piece of my integrative vision, my better human story that I put out. In the previous two live streams, I've read, interspersed with spontaneous commentary, to keep it alive for me and show it in some less disciplined ways to you. I've done two previous pieces. One showed that the step that our species took 10, 12,000 years ago onto the path of civilization, meaning extricating itself from, anyway, that step unleashed inevitably a systemic force because it created a new situation where things were disordered because we had extricated ourselves, first species ever to do it, from the niche in which we evolved biologically. That we can't understand anything about the world around us unless we see how it all came to be, which is civilization emerged out of the what had for 3.5 billion years been the creation of a certain kind of order. So I show that, and I think persuasively, that the way that civilization has developed has been, in important ways, not a function of who we are as creatures, not a function even of human choice, but a function of a systemic dynamic that inevitably emerges on any planet that any creature starts to invent its own way of life, extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically. And then the second thing I did in the next live stream, last Thursday, was about, it's an essay I call The Fate of Human Civilization, but I gave it a title here to show what direction I'm going in, which is to say that, basically, will we get our act together or will we destroy ourselves as the civilization creating species on this planet? And I show, to my satisfaction, that stepping onto the path of civilization means that eventually the species that did that is going to confront a central challenge of either ordering its civilization well enough and soon enough, or destroying itself. And in that piece, I also conjectured about what might have happened elsewhere in the cosmos with other creatures, which I'm just imagining because I don't know nothing about. But we do know that there are, the number of planets out there in the Milky Way alone, let alone the other billions of galaxies, so astronomical, as it were, that I feel with so many planets out there, there must have been a lot of other species that have been going through what we're going through. And I talk about, well, which ones survive and do get their, and which ones blow it. So that's what I did in the second one. And here the main event is going to be the discernible reality of a force of evil. I claim, and I hope you'll stick with me enough to see whether I deliver on this in the coming minutes of this live stream. I claim to be able to show something about the reality of there being actually kind of a battle, two coherent forces that inevitably emerge with a civilization creating species that behave very much like good and evil. And I think that for a lot of people who are of a secular worldview, as am I, that the idea that there might be something real and important that is reasonable to call a battle between good and evil is very alien to what I imagine most people think. But let me, give me a chance to show it, because I think I can. And let me also say that for me, this has been a life's work, and it has been spiritually very impactful. The spiritual dimension is not my long suit. I mean, if life were a game of bridge, I would have been dealt, a couple cards of the spiritual suit. But my strong suit is having been trained to be a good theoretical, empirical, interdisciplinary social scientist, his philosopher of history, whatever it is, the label should be put on me. It's intellectual is what I build. But I want to assure you that as we go through these essentially ideas, our evidence, arguments, that if you take it in, or at least for me, as I've taken in, well, first, a major piece of that book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, back in 1970, it blew me away. And there is a vision to be had, which I believe is valid, of the story of our species that's really the drama of a species like us that emerges out of the biological process with the creative intelligence for the first time in the history of the planet, a creature with the creative intelligence to do what human beings do with their minds, which includes inventing new ways of life, which is a big breakthrough. I mean, nobody else, including our hunting-gathering ancestors, hadn't really broken through to create whole new life form, we'll call civilization. But we got that creative intelligence. We used it to start making it possible for a culture to go in all sorts of directions. But we stepped out of a natural order. We stepped into an inevitable disorder in which there's among the societies that are having to interact with each other, in the absence of any order, a war of all against all inevitably breaks out. And, it's an of a creature being hoisted by its own petard. Our creative intelligence is what makes us, sort of wonderful and special. And we got Bach and we got Shakespeare and we got all these things that we've come up with because we're so dynamic intellectually. But when we employed that in perfectly reasonable ways, we unleashed a force. And now, in a minute, I'm going to talk about that destructive force and how it has properties and operates in a way which sort of aligns pretty well with in a purely secular way of understanding, but it identifies a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse or make it more broken, and that pretty well corresponds with what in the religious framework has been understood as how the force of evil works. That's supernatural and it's got, malevolent intent and all that stuff. This is more like this is the way it cranks out of the system. It's built into the nature of things that if life evolves to the point where the biosphere contains all these species and one of these species is able to break out of that order because it's got this creative intelligence, there are going to be some serious problems. And so if we get that perspective, we see that we're actually not as the things that we've interpreted as being the ugliness of the world, the human world, that we've interpreted as showing us who we are. It shows that it's not a function of who we are. It was a systemic dynamic, and that's what, I'm not going to go back into that systemic dynamic, but today I'm going to go into not the ugliness that we see in history is human nature, is not human nature writ large, which is a line I like, but instead to say that the ugliness we see in human history is a function of this coherent force that the step onto the path of civilization inevitably unleashes. And it behaves like a force of evil. I want to show you this sort of plan I've had for today. And I'm going to go rather quickly over these first two and get right to the force of evil thing that I think I can show in a purely secular way. The disproportionate role played by the worst kinds of people. I'm going to mostly put this off for another occasion because I want to try to write this up as an op-ed. One of my activities is putting op-eds out into the rather conservative red 2-to-1 Republican region where I ran for Congress 12 years ago. And I'm often putting out messages to the people on the other side of our political divide. But this one would be, if I do it and I run it, it'll be pointing toward this bigger human story. Okay, I'll just say that I believe that if you were to identify the 5 people in the world today who are having the biggest impact on shaping the world that we're in today, 4 of the 5 are sociopaths. There's one of those 4, Xi of China, that I don't know enough about to say just what kind of dude he is. But 3 of the 4 that are sociopaths, I know a fair amount about. And there's only one of the 5 that I think is basically expressing a constructive spirit, that one of the 5 is acting in ways that are reasonable to, are the result of his best effort to answer the question, what would make things better in the human world? with a definition of better that, would command pretty universal, more peace, less war, more love, less hatred, more justice, less injustice. One of the five. And for three of them showing enormous character defects. At least two of them being, I think, you would call them human monsters. I mean, we got a list of monsters. Well, who's a human monster? Well, Idi Amin was a monster. Stalin was a monster. Hitler was a monster. You can make a list of people who are just way out there. Like most of us never know anybody in our own lives who are nearly as monstrous as that. Unpleasant people we get to know, but not like these guys. And that it raises the question. I mean, that shows the idea that we don't know people who are as monstrous as that. People who would be as selfish as that. People who the whole list. People who would be as vicious as that. Just really profoundly broken people. And four of the five, or maybe only, depending on what you do with G, are way outside the norm. And yet they're having a disproportionate role in shaping our civilization. I mean, that was the premise, was pick what five people are having the biggest role on where the human world is going, and how it is to behold what's happening in the world today. It's not a very pleasant picture, and the question then would arise: well, if these guys are so unrepresentative, because being a monster is something that is kind of rare, and yet they're overrepresented in this fivesome. Why are they overrepresented? That would be something that would point toward these ideas that I'm presenting as a better human story, where I say why is it that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large? Well, this five people, of whom three or four are human monsters, or at least sociopaths, that illustrates how come ugliness. If you can explain why it is that it's like that right now in this moment of history, I think you uncover a lot of things about the forces at work in human civilization. So let me go to the essay that this was published on a site called Three Quarks Daily, where I was in that medium giving my best shot to lay out into the world this better human story. And these all this essay appeared under the title "The Discernible Reality of a Force of Evil." And in the first section is titled "Evil, Lost and Found." Over the centuries, for people whose worldview was governed by the religions of Western civilization, it was reasonably straightforward to conceive of the existence of a force of evil. Judeo-Christian religion personified such a force in the figure of Satan, or the devil. By the way, I just want to reiterate that if you're somebody who believes that there is and can be nothing that would be reasonable to call a force of evil, please suspend your disbelief. We'll get there. Imagining this supernatural being enabled people to form some intuitive conception of a force that makes bad things happen. The devil, with malevolent intent, was always working to get people to do what they shouldn't do and to degrade the human world. The devil could make the world uglier by wielding his powers with diabolical cleverness. Quoth Luther, For still our ancient foe doth seek. Oh, I forget the melody. This is for still doth seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal. So Luther is envisioning something in his world, that an ancient foe that seeks to work us woe, and that operates with craft and power, armed with cruel hate, and mighty in shaping the world. On earth is not his equal. I think we actually can see something that is a lot like that. We can understand why the story of our species has been so filled with the kinds of things you'd think it would be if 4 out of the 5 most impactful people of a given moment of history, like ours, are sociopaths and maybe human monsters. The more recent movement to a secular worldview has meant that this supernatural figure of Satan has disappeared from the picture of the human world, held in the minds of a major component of the Western world. And this disappearance of Satan left most of those people with no way of conceiving of something that might reasonably be called a force of evil. And with no way of conceiving anything so coherent as a force of evil operating in the world, many of those with a secular worldview were left unequipped to perceive such a force, even if it turned out to be an important reality. And here I'm talking about something I've talked about fairly regularly, which is that even though we're seeing something very ugly on the political right in America right now, essential to the ability of this coherent force of brokenness to take over a major component of the American power system. An essential thing that made that possible was on the other side of the political divide, where the lack of a concept that might enable one to conceive of a force of evil led to many of those of a secular worldview were left unequipped to perceive such a force, even if it turned out to be an important reality. So liberal America and the Democratic Party in the past 30 years, largely informed, at least so I conceive it. I mean, this is a result of my best effort to understand. I think that the secular worldview is predominant in the liberal side of America as a way of understanding things. And if a secular worldview doesn't include some way of conceiving and perceiving a force of evil when it's rising, then if that force of evil is rising, it will not be perceived and it will not be it could have been fought and defeated, at the beginning. And it wasn't. It wasn't recognized until it had become really big and threatening. It reminds me of a Sufi story, if it's okay for me to digress on the way well, I'm going to do it. There's a Sufi story about a sort of a mystic, highly religious person who goes into the wilderness, or the desert, in some hut, and is huddled over these sacred texts. And there's this little fly that's buzzing around him, and he doesn't pay any attention. And there's a sequence of things where he's so focused on his thing, he doesn't recognize how this fly is becoming larger and larger and more menacing. He doesn't recognize the signs that this is an evil genie. This is a Sufi story from the Muslim tradition. So it's got like Aladdin, it's got a genie, and the genie isn't necessarily Robin Williams all the time with a great patter. The genie can be an evil and destructive thing, and he's not paying attention as it's getting bigger and bigger. And then finally, the genie bursts into his full form, kills the man, breaks the hut down, and steams out into the world. It shows that it is important to recognize a threat when it first arises. Things in the cradle will grow up to be bigger things later. So if it's purely destructive, good to recognize what it is early on when it can be easily defeated. But the Democrats, as the Republican Party of, say, well, Reagan and the first Bush was still a normal party. And then a transformation began to occur that you could see with the rise of Newt Gingrich and the rise of Rush Limbaugh, and the coming of Fox News and then Karl Rove. You could see there was a transformation happening, and the Democrats did not recognize that the nature of the political battle had changed fundamentally. We weren't fighting over issues anymore. We were fighting a force of destruction where increasingly, instead of being a normal party that's part corrupt and part constructive, it was starting to be a party that never was doing anything that made the world better, never saying anything that made the world better, always in the opposite direction. That kind of consistency is a clue. And not having a way of thinking about the forces at work in the human world, the secular worldview informed the liberal America and the Democratic Party in such a way that, let me get myself back in here. Let's turn this guy off. So there are implications to how we understand the world. If we understand the world as a place where Satan's gone away and nothing takes its place, and there is no such thing as a force of evil, and then there emerges a coherent force that's consistently working to make things worse in the human world, it's not recognized. And we're like America is very much like the guy in the Sufi story. We're on the threshold of maybe losing our democracy. There's whether you are equipped to see something that's important and real. And here I am trying to show that there is such a thing, a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse, that can be understood as an inevitable consequence of being a creature that broke out of the naturally evolved order and inevitably into a disorder that unleashed a destructive force that then ramifies through the human world in a way which explains why we've had to struggle so much and why we're struggling right now against a force of fascism. Okay. Ill-equipped to perceive such a force, even if it turned out to be an important reality. And it turns out that there is such a force. It turns out that one can see, operating in the human world, a coherent force that consistently makes things worse or consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness. I.e., we can see at work in our world something that aligns in so many ways with the ancient, freighted concept of evil. Aligns so well that it makes sense to call it that. For those who dislike that ancient word, evil, and nearly 2 decades of experience have taught me that includes many liberals, I suggest forgetting about that fraught word and substituting instead force of destruction or force of brokenness, both of which capture its essence. But I still do want to sell the idea that maybe calling it evil is helpful. Conceptually, it can be essentially the same thing. Force of brokenness is entirely satisfactory for describing it. But the culture has put into us certain patterns of feeling and depths of resonance around certain words that's part of our experience of a concept. And if you call something a force of brokenness, that's one experience. If you call it a force of evil, that's another experience. And I believe that the emotional, spiritual resonances that go with evil are important to tap into. I think part of the weakness of defending the opposite of evil, the good, has been because we're not connected well enough with the moral and spiritual passions that evolution put into us. But that's another piece. That would be a piece I'll be reading about later, that there are things in us because of what evolution put them into us, the fact that evolution put them into us, and these are experiential dimensions. The fact that tells us, because that's the way biological evolution works, that they must have been helped our ancestors to survive, to put their DNA into the future. They must have been life-serving. And that's testimony in a purely empirical, logical way to the fact that the moral and spiritual passions are life-serving and they are real because evolution made them part of what we are. Another time. It does not much matter what we call it, whether evil or not, though it does matter some, I think. What does matter is that we see that there is an it to be called. That is something coherent in its operation and consistent in the direction toward which it pushes the human world. And it, something that is not just all these different things like hatred, injustice, war, a pattern of brokenness, something that's coherent and that is consistently destructive. And it. Indeed, it turns out to matter greatly because it turns out that the inability to see that it, that destructive force or force of evil, can be catastrophic. This better human story, I think, can have a beneficial impact because I have seen how, whether one understands or fails to understand the nature of the forces at work in the human world, hugely impacts whether or not it's destructive or constructive forces that prevail. I mean, when we're facing the possibility of America choosing fascism, really unthinkable than the America I grew up in. I bet if you went around to any of the worlds that I inhabited in the 1950s or the 1960s, I don't know, all the way up to maybe the 1990s. Was it plausible that America would be in this situation in 2024? You know, where it's possible that a person who had said and done all this stuff and showed this, all the whole picture being right out there, and a political party that had behaved in all the ways that it had behaved, would be having a significant chance of being able to seize hold of the powers of the United States government and take the American system in the directions that are being laid out there as a plan. I think that everybody you would have talked talked to would have said that couldn't happen, or almost everybody, or so improbable that it it defies plausibility to imagine it. I think about a book. Was it Philip Roth wrote a book envisioning what if America in 1940 had elected a fascistic leader, Charles Lindbergh, I think, president. I think the people used to say it can't happen here. And I think the name of his novel about America going in a fascist direction in 1940 is called "It Can Happen Here." And I don't remember when he wrote that, but I don't. I don't remember people really envisioning that it really could have happened here, or that at least that the America we were in then was one out of which this kind of America that we see right now could have happened. The blindness of the Democrats to the rise of a force of evil, I'm being stubborn about this, I guess, demonstrate that not only is the wisdom of the world of baseball right in saying you can't hit what you can't see, but also you can't see what you have no conceptual way of including in the picture of reality. There's something rattling in the back of my brain about how the Native Americans of the Aztec world reacted when Cortez and his ships landed on the coast of Mexico. That there was something that they had no concept for about the ships or something, and therefore they couldn't see them. Anyway, there's some story to be had that illustrates that you really have to have a concept for something sometimes to be able to recognize when it's right in front of your eyes. The blindness of the Democrats to the rise of the force of evil demonstrates that not only, oh, okay, I did that, you can't see what you have no concept for. FDR, a liberal at a time when the old worldview held greater sway, understood evil in the old way, and that helped him defeat evil in World War II. Barack Obama, apparently, did not understand evil, didn't have much of a concept of it, didn't see it when it was coming at him, and as a result, ended up barricaded in the White House with his presidency stripped of its powers except for issuing executive orders. And while this exceptionally decent and best-intentioned man was president, his failure to recognize the reality of a force of evil enabled that force to gain in power. Like the Sufi story, he was engaged in a kind of political set of interactions that ignored what was rising up against him instead of confronting it, fighting it, defeating it. And it was obvious early on. I had an open-ended, an open letter to Obama published as an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun in December of 2009. In other words, he's not yet been president. And I said, you need to fight the battle that you were elected to lead and not forfeit the battle. But indeed, inadvertently made it possible for what previous generations of Americans would have regarded as unthinkable to happen. That is, for a human monster like Donald Trump to become president of the United States and take possession of one of America's two major political parties and a major component of the American people. This force that needed to be punished for one thing after another that it did that was destructive, was instead able to reap political benefit because of the weakness and blindness on the other side. And to name an example of blindness to essentially a force of brokenness and a willingness to press the battle against it. At the time, I wrote, at the time when Barack Obama's constitutional right and power to name the next justice of the Supreme Court after, what's his name, Scalia died. After the Republicans essentially perverted the idea of the Senate's advise and consent to mean we're not going to let you not name anybody. I gently griped a little bit, but I wrote at the time that this was a battle to take to the Supreme Court. This was a power grab by the Senate under the name of advise and consent that was never envisioned by our founders. I think that was a case that could have been made compellingly. And even if this increasingly corrupt Supreme Court refused to hear the case because it's a political matter, but I mean, it isn't a political matter. It was a legal matter. Did the Senate have any right not to block Obama from naming? I don't think they did. But even if it would have dramatized. People would have been talking about what the Republicans were doing. A study had come out from, I think, a professor of legal history at Northwestern and maybe one at the University of Chicago. That's my recollection. It showed that that what the Republicans were doing were absolutely unprecedented. Over 100 different cases you look at, and this was unprecedented, and there was no reason for it and no justification for it. I don't know if they argued the latter points, but they showed at least that there was no precedent, and I believe that they showed that it was, contrary to the understanding of what advise and consent would be. There was a case to be made, and at least it should have been made to the American people. I mean, you want behavior like that to be punished, and instead, the Republicans got a seat. First of all, they got a 5-4 Republican majority, which decided case after case, 5-4, that sent America in bad directions. It was hugely consequential that the Republicans stole that seat. They got to have a Supreme Court that would decide case after case in the wrong way, that served the plutocracy, that served the theocrats, that served the things that take American society in a direction of greater brokenness. In this failure to fight the fight that needed to be fought, Obama was emblematic of a widespread inability in the Democratic Party of these times. Even as the other side was being taken over by a coherent force that consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness, the Democrats talked about their friends across the aisle because there was no word in their language, no concept in their minds for the kind of force that had taken over the Republican Party. This appears to be a major cost of the current underdevelopment of our still relatively new secular worldview. But as I will attempt now to show, it is possible to perceive and understand the reality of a force of evil in a purely secular framework. That understanding takes a bit of work. I was saying that my long suit is the, in, the understanding dimension, the intellectual dimension. And I think about how one can, in a musical forum or in a religious, listening to a sermon, that people can be moved more directly by those other kinds of expression. But one can get there also with ideas to see and understand something as huge and consequential as this story of the civilization creating species. Well, it's been profoundly moving in my life, but it takes a process of thought. That work is worth it because the more people can see what we're up against, which is the title of that book, the stronger will be the forces of democracy that now are embattled against the force of fascism. And the stronger will be the forces that might help civilization to get its act together in time to avoid self-destruction. It is in that spirit, as part of addressing the systemic problem of America's brokenness, in which one side of the system went over to brokenness, while the other side had lost the moral understanding to recognize how the nature of the American political battle had changed and how it needed to be fought. That it had become essentially at the battle of what we might reasonably call good and evil. I will now turn to the task of showing that reality. And here's sort of my favorite way of showing it. When it comes to a political party or some other actor that itself is so possessed by such a force that whatever everything it does, or approximately everything it does, makes things worse. That's actually how I discovered it. But this is a different way of conceiving it or perceiving it. It's as something that moves through time rather than something which is localized in one of the actors. It's the same force, but to be perceived differently. It's not all the time that there is some actor on the stage, a political party or a regime like the Nazi regime of Germany, that's consistently being destructive. But it is all the time that there is brokenness, a force of brokenness working through the world. And that's what this approach shows. The bad news is that seeing this force of evil doesn't come as naturally to us humans as seeing that it personified in the figure of the devil. I mean, we can all conceive of what's shown in the medieval literature of the devil and its viciousness, and Luther with his ancient foe, and the smell of sulfur, and the various I think of the book that Norman O. Brown wrote, Life Against Death, where he goes a whole lot into sort of the scatological, the anal, the connection with the force of evil in the emerging Protestantism. There are sort of visceral ways of understanding evil that were provided in the religious perspective. And it is easy to teach people to be able to vision the devil. And a lot of people through history have thought, the devil made me do it, or she's possessed of devils, or stuff like that. I mean, it's all so visceral when you've got these supernatural beings that are the agents of the spreading of a pattern of brokenness in the world. That's the advantage of representing evil in terms of malevolent, supernatural forces. But the challenge is different when we operate within a secular worldview, from which supernatural beings and forces are excluded. The reality of this force, as I will show, becomes visible as a natural dynamic through observation of the evidence presented in the dense network of causes and effects. And it is from that set of connections in the dense network of cause and effect that logical inferences can be drawn. So it takes some work, it being a construct of ideas and evidence from which sound conclusions can be drawn. But as the American crisis demonstrates, among the strengths required of us to protect the good against evil, some of them require that we undertake the intellectual work required to see it. You know, it strikes me that, first of all, we in this world are in a very unnatural situation. I mean, if you think about how all the generations going back that didn't have to deal with, like hunting gatherer, the earliest Homo sapiens, and there's no reason why we need to just start there, but even just starting there, like they're going back 300,000 years, and all kinds of adventures and interbreeding with various other kinds of hominids like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. But, a real story, but all the way up to 10 or 12,000 years ago. We're living in a particular kind of world where people are living off what nature spontaneously provides. They were living in more or less egalitarian bands. They were pretty much living like primates. There hadn't been any major discontinuity. So that's who we evolved to be. I expect, from what I know from the anthropology, you don't have to go. I don't know whether hunting and gathering peoples had ways of conceiving of evil. I would actually be rather interested, but certainly in the various things which follow out of the hunting gathering into the horticultural and the various tribal, the idea of malevolent beings emerges, I think, in a pretty widespread way. So that's something that people pick up rather easily, and it does not appear that putting together understandings in what we of the modern secular worldview would regard as intellectually responsible ways, it doesn't seem as though that's been a hugely dominant part of how human consciousness has worked to create pictures for people to live in. I think Satan is a lot more representative than what I'm here to present. What part of what makes the Greeks sort of special is that they were very early in developing some kind of intellectual discipline and rigor, and Socratic dialogues and Aristotelian systematic pictures, and asking the question of, well, what is the most fundamental thing from which everything else gets built up? Those kinds of questions were not generally asked. And here, so I'm saying that we have created a very unnatural situation on the planet. An unnatural situation requires of us that we exert our minds to understand what we're dealing with, to a degree that doesn't come so easily as, coming up with myths like Tolkien does, or like the Star Wars trilogies, and like Avatar, where we get really viscerally into it and very easily feel like we are having to fight a battle against a force of evil. Well, in the world that we actually exist in, where we might be, where this might be become a fascistic country, no longer the leader of the free world, and where we might blow ourselves up in the next few generations in a nuclear holocaust, or this climate crisis may actually bring the whole thing down on our heads. You know, we live in a pretty unnatural situation, and we need to understand it in the ways that the secular worldview is champion of that kind of understanding, of knowledge that's valid, that understands what it is that has happened and what it is that needs to happen. So here's one way to envision this coherent force that acts like evil. Consider the dichotomous pairs of war and peace, injustice and justice, hatred and love, cruelty and kindness, greed and generosity, hypocrisy and integrity, deception and honesty, death dealing versus life dealing. For any particular instance of any of those on the broken side of such dichotomies that we can see in the human world, we can ask two kinds of questions regarding their place in the dense web of causes and effects. Peering backward, we can inquire about its causes. What is it in the world that produces this brokenness? I'm inviting you to envision that there are just skillions and skillions of things continually happening in the human world, and that everything that happens continues to generate its to be the result of things that were existing or moving before, and then have the consequences about how it has an impact on the world after. What were the factors that led to this exploitative social arrangement? Or what is it that resulted in this person being cruel or greedy or insistent on domination? Many see evil just in terms of evil people, but people are shaped by their world. In other words, the brokenness in people is the result of causes. Looking forward, we can examine the effects of these various particulars, of that war, of that exploitation, or of this instance of human cruelty or greed or lust for power. What impact does this or that broken thing in our world have on how the human world develops from there? In an unsystematic way, I've been asking those kinds of questions for more than half a century. Investigating questions like, what led to the American Civil War over the issue of slavery? And what led to the rise of the Nazi regime? And what experiences and cultural influences molded the human monsters who have played a disproportionate role in our history, like Hitler and Stalin? What are the factors that differentiate those people inclined to hate outgroups from those without such hostilities? On the side of wholeness, what cultural currents made possible the emergence of democracy on the North American continent, etc.? What stands out from tracing the various connections of causes and effects is a pretty straightforward pattern. With brokenness understood as whatever is the opposite of life-serving, that is, as leading to the opposite of the well-being and fulfillment of sentient creatures, defined as creatures to whom things matter. and the perpetuation of their kind. What we see when we make all those connections is a pretty straightforward pattern. Namely, brokenness begets brokenness. And conversely, wholeness begets wholeness. For though sometimes good intentions can lead to hellish results, and an ill wind can blow somebody good, on the whole, those things that are broken are the consequence of things that were broken in the world before. In that dense network of cause and effects, one can trace how wars and injustices and hatreds and trauma all feed each other over time. Each form of brokenness tends to generate other forms of brokenness and be generated by them. Tracing the way each thing that makes the world worse is the fruit of other things that make the human world worse reveals a pattern of brokenness traveling through the cultural system. We can see brokenness getting transmitted over time from level to level, global to societal to individual, and back the other way, and transmitted from form to form. We can see how the brokenness of hatred makes the world worse, generating, for example, the brokenness of conflict. The way wholeness aligns with goodness and the opposite of brokenness is suggested by a pair that I often cite. The two messages that are when in the Bible, in the New Testament, when Jesus is born, the two messages that are delivered to the world by the angels, if I recall correctly from my Christmas cards, are peace on earth and goodwill toward men. And those are really among the most fundamental ingredients of a world that would be whole. That's if those two could prevail over their opposites, over war on earth and over hatred among peoples, we would be on a path toward having a truly whole world. But we're still dealing with this thing that I'm trying to spin out as something visible in the human world, a coherent force. The connections made between causes and effects, and then further effects of the first effect. How brokenness begets brokenness. We can see how the brokenness of war produces the brokenness of trauma, and how the lust to dominate creates the brokenness of injustice. There's a book that I wrote after I showed how with the parable of the tribes, here's the parable of tribes. It shows that brokenness is an inevitable result of the breakthrough into civilization, a force of brokenness because of the disorder. But I meant to show the consequence when it comes to how brokenness begets brokenness. If you're going to have a war of all against all, it's going to lead to that pattern of brokenness that's embodied in the inevitable war against all is going to transmit a pattern of the brokenness in new forms of the people who are traumatized. by having to live in a world in which inevitably that's what happens, because the breakthrough into civilization is inevitably, for any species, whatever its nature, going to be descent into that kind of disorder. There is a reason why the dawn of civilization, I think, essentially brings the force of evil into existence. Again, I'm not sure what I would find if I looked at, hunting gathering societies were scattered all over the planet before the very first steps onto the path of civilization, like gardens and herds and such. I don't know whether, if you looked at all those societies and their rituals and their myths and their legends and their belief systems of all kinds, I don't know what you'd find with respect to a concept of some force of evil. I would be very interested to know. But I think that if there is one, um, it would be of small consequence compared to what emerges inevitably with civilization and its war of all against all, and it's inflicting such brokenness, the lust to dominate, the cruelty, the tendency to hate, the tendency to project. All those connections can be made that because of this inevitable war of all against all, you end up with the ugliness of the world that God wanted to create, to destroy in the time of Noah. When civilization's been going on for a while, he looks down and he says, "Oi, such a lousy bunch I created. I want to kill them all, except I'll tell this one to build an ark." Well, that was inevitable, because an inevitable anarchy is inevitably accompanying the emergence of civilization. Easy to show, logical evidence, etc. Anarchy means the war of all against all. And basically it means that the gangster is going to rise to have a disproportionate say in which direction things go. And, people are living in that world. There's chronic warfare, inevitably. Some of the worst of human beings, the worst of our potentialities are magnified into essentially necessities, the things that can prevail in a war against all against all. Well, we've seen that in Lebanon and Somalia. That it's warlords. It's warlords, it's gangsters that rise to the top, just like I was saying. Look at the 5 most impactful people on the planet right now, and 4 of them, I think 4 of them are basically sociopaths. They all have a lust to dominate anyhow. That much they all got, except for one of them, 4 out of 5. And it's extraordinary to have human monsters play such a large role as we see here, and as we see with the rise of civilization. So it's a pretty ugly world that inflicts a lot of suffering on a lot of people through the generations. And we can see, oh gosh, there's got to be so much ugliness, so much brokenness cascading through the human world, where whatever it is that we would be by nature, fairly, good enough and for a hunting gathering world, is now going to have all this brokenness inflicted on it, and have all these varieties of things that the inevitable selective process can choose among. And so we see things going back and forth, broken people, broken systems, because the force of brokenness has been unleashed into the human world. We can see how the lust that dominates creates the brokenness of injustice, how unbridled selfishness generates the brokenness of human misery, how the brokenness of childhood trauma and historical trauma feed upon each other to achieve greater brokenness through having a Hitler in power or a Trump in power. something worth calling brokenness, is moving through the human world in shape-shifting ways, a pattern of brokenness. And something worth calling a force can be inferred to be pushing brokenness through the system over time. I know that people sometimes feel like I don't make it clear enough what I'm talking about when I talk about a force. A force is something that moves things. Like in physics with the elementary formula, F for force equals ma, mass times acceleration. And so it is with this force that imparts brokenness to the human world as the generations and the centuries go by. I kind of like to liken it with what was understood from Newton onward about the force of gravity as a way of explaining the motion of the Earth around the sun and the motion of the other planets around the sun. The force of gravity. And here we have a different force, a force that's moving a pattern of brokenness through the system over time. This force is a natural dynamic. It's not supernatural. It's something that just inevitably arises because of the situation in which the breakout from the order of the natural world into a disorder inevitably leads to the brokenness of an interaction, a set of interactions that have not been ordered by any life-serving order. And I say that when you look at how the causes and effects trace the pattern of brokenness being moved through the system over time, we can see that force in the way that we can see the wind in the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. The consistent pattern of brokenness moving through time makes something visible that's operating in the human world. It's a coherent force that consistently makes the human world more broken or worse, and that is moving in subtle ways, interweaving with everything else, making people more or less susceptible to being enlisted in the force of brokenness. So you can see that, for example, in that part of the American electorate, which right now is poised to give us, maybe plunge us into a new era of where fascism has displaced the constitutional order. We can trace in the realm of cause and effect some of the ways in which all this came to be, that such a force would get the kind of power over the minds of enough Americans that the democratic process could be utilized to transform the democracy into a fascistic state. It's very complicated to see how child rearing practices and cultural patterns, there's a lot of ways in which you can see that what happened to create the Confederacy, to trigger the Civil War, and to sell the post-Civil War regime, that a lot of that can be seen to be participating in what's happening in America now. It's not a simple pattern, but the existence of this coherent force is visible. The way the wind can be seen, not directly, but in the way things are being moved by something, and we can infer the nature of that something from the way things are getting moved. If each broken thing in the world is a product of prior embodiments of the pattern of brokenness, the question arises, well, how did brokenness get into the system in the first place? And answering that question will be the starting point of the next piece in this series. So I'll go into it more, but I've been alluding to it this whole time. There's something about the breakthrough into civilization, which underlies the whole thing. Because the nature of the natural order is that things get continually selected for so that all the various actors are acting in some synergistic way to perpetuate the system as a whole on this planet. As long, having to deal sometimes with asteroids or ice ages and being dependent on the input of energy from the sun outside the living system, but basically life keeps on in this first biological stage of evolution, is consistently creating relationships that on a more superficial level are bloody, competitive, and destructive, like the wolf falling upon the sheep. But it turns out that what's being selected for is a whole pattern of relationships, so that when the wolf falls upon the sheep, more fundamentally than it being bloody at the expense of the sheep, in the overarching system is part of the pattern of the survival, not just for the wolves, but for the sheep as well. If there weren't any wolves, and we've seen this problem arise, you want an ecological balance. That's what works for the long haul. That's what the biosphere continually is working to create, just by selecting what is able, not by purpose, but by selecting those things that are successful in getting their DNA into the future. That's just what happens. But you extricate yourself from that order, and you are condemned to leave that kind of order and to deal with a new kind of disorder that civilization inevitably plunges into. And the long-term survival of civilization requires that force that gets unleashed at the beginning, that spreads a pattern of brokenness from the beginnings of the chronic war of all against all the way through. And we still are in that system, which is a war of all against all. Just ask the Ukrainians if there's anything in the system to prevent something like Putin descending upon them, not like the wolf on the sheep, but like a wolf and a sheep that are outside of any well-ordered system whatsoever. A major clue to solving that prime mover problem can be found in the previous piece in this series, which has got where I present that parable tribes idea, introducing it with the Carney Barker line: the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature at large. And there I talk about basically that there's a social evolutionary force that inevitably emerges because of the disorder. It's a selection for the ways of power. It's a selection for things that basically give the spirit of the gangster way too much say on how the human world will be. It produces a world in which human monsters, like you wouldn't find in 500 people, but are highly populated, the most, the ranks of the people with the greatest impact on the way civilization unfolds. Well, let's see. How do I proceed? I guess that's mostly it. That's mostly that there is a force that can be seen. And it's like a force of evil in that it's a coherent force. Usually you have to look very closely to see how it's coherent, because it's usually something like, an individual or a political party or a country that's got its, its virtues and its defects in moral terms, and acts in a world that has mixed results, and that's how it usually is. But you can see that why didn't this political party do this better thing, or why didn't this person choose to do this? Well, you can still see that hatreds and various forms of brokenness are having their impact on the world. Each one of us are in the world in some ways that are better, in some ways that are for the worse, and we have a mixed impact on the world. And so it is with everything until you get to where you get something which really shows, because it's sort of a pure case of brokenness. Like the political force that now dominates the political force of conservative America is now essentially a pure case that is not. I mean, I cannot find places where it's having a beneficial impact on the world. It just seems consistently the opposite. And I first saw that this was the case. Well, I first saw it in 2004, but of course it's become far more pronounced now. So that's where I discovered, oh my gosh, how does something like this happen? If everything it does is essentially destructive, what is the wind that I'm seeing in the swaying of these trees? And that led me to doing much more thinking and coming up with this idea of the way brokenness begets brokenness, and the original brokenness that had been sort of like the beginnings of my whole human story back in 1970. That idea about the problem of power unleashes something on the world that makes people worse. That leads to that plays a role in generating human monsters, and then continuing selection for those social options that are able to survive in a disordered world where something like the Russian invasion of Ukraine can happen, because there's nothing to prevent a human monster from gaining hold of a whole country, being the possessor of a massive nuclear arsenal, and invade a society that's on the path of improvement, of becoming more democratic, that has the right to exist. That human monster single-handedly had the impact on the world of returning Europe to from a much better kind of order that had achieved over the World War II, post-World War II generations, back to a world where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And it turns out that the force of fascism in the world has become so powerful. I mean, it is really quite the rise of a destructive force. In a modern form, so that the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party is able to strangle the flow of much-needed weapons to the society that's willing to fight against this rising evil force that Putin's representing. Yeah. One of the questions that arises in terms of understanding the forces at work in the human world in our times. I feel like I can say a lot about how the force of fascism emerged and has seized hold of a lot of people's minds in the United States. But I don't feel satisfied that I understand. No, I really don't understand adequately why it is that fascistic forces have become have gained ground against democracy, taking these as sort of two names to give two basic concepts of how power can be organized in the human world. The bottom up one is really the big step forward humankind has been taking in recent centuries. The top down one is the one that we fell into with the rise of the first generation, the rise of the first empires and tyrannies, what thousands of years ago, all the way up to the rise of the fascist regimes of the 30s and the 40s, the totalitarian regimes of Stalinist communism and Nazi fascism, and the top down versus bottom up is a fundamental choice that civilization has been striving to make. Is power going to serve people, or is power going to be able to exploit and compel people to serve it? That has been a fundamental question from the beginning. And it inevitably arises in a world in which those cultural options that can prevail in a war of all against all are going to be the ones that can survive and spread. The better ones, unless they somehow confer, the United States has been able to survive as a democracy partly because it's a democracy. But a lot of the things that make us really good are irrelevant to the fact that we had the capacity to win what some people described about World War II as the GNP or GDP war. I mean, we could outproduce our enemies. That was the thing. And it wasn't the goodness of America, at least not that alone, that enabled the United States to win the Cold War. It was our technological dynamism. I mean, and our economic productivity that the Soviets simply were not able to match us. You know, they had to essentially. Well, I don't fully understand why the Soviet Union fell, but it did appear that they were not able to maintain the arms race, and they made some strategic blunders, like our blunder in Vietnam, their blunder in Afghanistan. But they had a more brittle regime. Also wonder whether, had there been a less humane person than Gorbachev around, would Stalin have found a way to keep the Soviet totalitarian state in power and keep the Eastern Europe under its iron grip? I don't know, but anyway, it wasn't our goodness. Our goodness was actually relevant in the way that we were able to become the leader of a whole cadre of basically decent societies that were also affluent. We were, as a Western alliance, very mighty. But goodness is not the same thing as power. It wasn't the goodness of the European implant that enabled them to steal over the course of a couple centuries the North American continent from a Native American set of societies that that got here first. But the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Good versus evil. A fundamental drama that emerges with civilization. I believe that I can make the case that any creature, any planet, on anywhere in the cosmos is going to, if it takes a step onto the path of civilization, will unleash coherent forces, there will be this selection for the ways of power, which is selection for a lot of things that are pretty good, but it's way short of being a selection on the basis of goodness. It's also a selection that gives the spirit of the gangster a disproportionate say. That any creature is going to unleash that force, and it's also going to have inevitably its own needs, its own evaluative system that has been evolved into it, because a cultural animal will be an animal that um, knows how to make life-serving choices. You don't even have to be um, a cultural animal. We know that other mammals experience things in terms of better and worse. And who knows? I don't know how far down you could go and say that there's an experiential dimension. Uh, but 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 one of the strategies that life comes up with, and the great thing about biological evolution is that it's purely opportune. I mean, I'm not going to say this is a great thing. It's an important thing. It's purely opportunistic, and it's enormously creative. So that if there's a niche that can be filled, if there's a strategy that can work, it will find some. There will be a species that will emerge to fill that niche, and one of the strategies that gets selected for is the experiencing of things as a positive experience or as a negative experience, so that there's a motivation to behave in certain ways and to avoid behaving in other ways, because and that gets selected because that motivation was correlated with success of our distant ancestors in getting their DNA into the future. We are that DNA future. And what gets selected for experientially in our tendencies is whatever helped our ancestors succeed at that game of get your DNA into the future, which is the game in the biological field. And so we have been given the capacity to experience things as good. And that positivity is really the basis of value, and the only conceivable basis of value. That's a whole nother issue. That value is real because people, beings, experience a better and a worse. And if there were nothing to whom anything mattered, if everything was equal in terms of the better and worse, then nothing could matter and nothing could be of any value. Value is an emergent property, inevitably. And any creature that's sophisticated enough not to be so governed by pure instinct, to not need, like, does a protozoa experience better and worse? I don't know. It'll automatically do what it needs to do. I don't know. But we are not automatic. My cat is not automatic. We have a valuative system that's built into us, and it correlates with what has been life serving in the past. And we human beings not only have a better and a worse, and an inborn human value system that I'm not going to try to show here now, but readily becomes the foundation for the good to be real, important, and life-serving. The human fulfillment in experiential is inherently a good, the only kind of good that can exist, and that it correlates with that experiential dimension correlates with survival into the future. And we share that with a whole lot of other creatures. And I don't know if we share or don't share another capacity, which is a capacity for a certain special realm of experience which people can enter into, because I mean it's just factual. In any human community, you'll find people, a fair proportion of people have life-serving, spiritually transformative experiences that have a special quality, that have a larger than usual impact, that deliver perhaps things which are thereafter held as major spiritual truths, that often are experienced. Some things are experienced as being of enormous special kind of value that we might call sacred. These are simply facts that human beings have such experiences, and that they are impactful, that they change how people behave. They might change the whole course of a life. And that has been my experience, and a lot of other people. And that we wouldn't have that capacity unless that capacity that got built into the genome, it wouldn't have gotten built into the genome if it hadn't helped our ancestors to get their DNA into the future. And it wouldn't have helped to get their DNA into the future if the impact they had wasn't beneficial in the sense of life-serving. So we've got within us a couple of experiential dimensions. One that provides a foundation for what you might call the moral dimension of the good, being real, important, and life-serving, and then this additional dimension, which unlike fulfillment and pleasure and happiness and gladness and stuff like that, that we can share with our pets. But this one about the spiritually transformative experience, I don't know whether we share that with any other creatures. And when deer are sitting there watching sunset, are they having spiritually impactful experiences? The elephants on their burial grounds. I just don't know, but we humans definitely do have it. And I also have a piece on my website, betterhumanstory.org, which there's a category about our spiritual experiential tendencies that evolution has given us. There's a piece about how lots of reason to believe that the messages that people get in that special experiential space tend to be valid and life-serving and lead to a better human world. So we have, what I'm saying, that the evolutionary perspective gives us two major consequences that should be integrated into the secular worldview. It ain't just Darwinian selection that explains why the finches had these beaks on the Galapagos Island, different Galapagos Islands, as selection chose for the beak suitable to those. It's bigger than that. That evolution, the evolutionary perspective shows us, first of all, that the moment that we stepped onto the path of civilization was to step out of the whole naturally evolved order. Have I been little this whole time? I hope not. Oh, yeah. That book, The Parable of Tribes, focuses on the moment where a creature, for the first time in life's history of 3.5 billion years, there's a creature that steps out of the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. That is a moment that the evolutionary perspective says, whoa, this is a whole new situation that has enormous ramifications, and that this is about those ramifications. A new evolutionary process superimposed on the other. Very troublesome. We're the tragic hero that's hoisted by our own petard. Our creative intelligence enabled us to escape some confines that we'd been in, like every other creature. But that escape was not an escape into as much freedom as we might have imagined. the way civilization has developed has not been reflective of human choice. Well, I don't know how much. And this is a question I ask myself regularly. How much of how civilization has developed is explained by the selection for the ways of power? I think it's major. And I don't know in percentage terms. If we hadn't had to contend with the inevitable social evolutionary process that inevitably gave the spirit of the gangster way too much say, I think we would have done a whole lot better in creating a better human world. But the fact is that, well, my assertion is, and I think the evidence is compelling. It's had a major and problematic impact on how civilization has developed, that there's been this disorder and the selection for the ways of power. We wouldn't see it if we didn't look closely at the implications of evolution. Evolution has to be understood not just in the way that the 19th century English and then American, like social Darwinists and stuff, understood it. Oh, nature red in tooth and claw, and not just in terms of competition. And those are true, but the overarching system has got to do with the need for synergy in order to gain viability, because the future belongs to things that have long-term viability, and long-term viability requires an overarching order. The lion and the zebra and the grass create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. That's how evolution needs to be understood, and there's a lot more emphasis in the Europe of the late 19th century and the emerging capitalist robber baron era and all that on it basically was being used as a justification for the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. But it was operating in a different situation. I mean, the wolf and the lamb and the lion and the zebra, they're existing in a situation in which nobody's left the niche in which they've evolved biologically. So part of the working of the secular worldview that I'm proposing is to incorporate, first of all, the understanding that order is essentially what life creates. From the level of the cell all the way to the biosphere, species, and interaction, and all that stuff. Wholeness is the thing. Creating order. And then to understand, well, it's a pretty risky thing to leave that order, because it's not like you're going to be able to create a new order overnight. You're going to fall into a disorder. So the force of evil, which meant war of all against all, selection for the ways of power, people being tyrannized and exploited, all that stuff. It's a force that you can see spreading a pattern of brokenness through time as all this war of all against all continues even into our times. And people are having to deal with a psyche that's been traumatized and also has been forced to internalize societal demands of societies that haven't been shaped as much by human needs as we would have wished. The demands of power have shaped them too much, and we internalize their demands, and so we become also the first creatures that are broken in the sense that we don't even have the right to be our natural selves. I mean, doing what comes naturally. Everybody else out there in Natureville is able to do that. Freud's Civilization and Discontents misunderstands that, but he did at least perceive in his Victorian Europe that people were pretty broken. That the internalized superego, the paternal introject, from the society that had created this power system, was warring with the id, and the id was sort of represented as being this enraged. Well, I mean, and the id isn't the same as an id would be if human needs were getting met better. The people whose forbidden impulses are the most destructive are the people who have not been able to reconcile what they've internalized with what they by nature need. Freud recognized that conflict, but misunderstood it when he wrote Civilization is Discontents. Didn't recognize how much the civilization around him had been shaped by forces other than human nature. The ugliness we see in human nature, in human history, and in the Victorian Vienna is not human nature at large. So if you don't attend to the real implications of stepping out of the niche in which we evolved biologically and taking an unprecedented step into an unprecedented situation, then you're not going to understand what the nature of the human story is. It isn't like in Civilization is Discontents that we're completely incapacitated because of our chaotic impulses. The problem is that there's this force pushing a pattern of brokenness from level to level, including breaking us. So the evolutionary perspective puts our history in a very different light and helps to explain how there emerges a force of evil. On the other side, the evolutionary perspective says that evolution shapes us in ways that are life-serving. I wrote a piece recently. I think I did a video too about if the saying "curiosity kills the cat," or "killed the cat," I guess is the phrase. And as if basically what people say to you when they're telling you don't be so curious. But the evolutionary perspective tells us that if it was the tendency of curiosity that it kills the curious cat, cats wouldn't be curious. If cats, in fact, are curious, it follows that the evolutionary process is selected for curiosity to be part of the motivational structure of cats. It's good to be curious. I mean, there's no guarantee you won't sometimes sniff your way into disaster, but it's there because it helps their ancestors to get their DNA into the future. It's adaptive. It's life-serving. That is what we can infer in general if we find something in our nature. And I've said before how, and I'm not going to go deeper into it. I think it's one of the future things that I'll be reading that I think lays it out compellingly. But value is connected with life. In a dead universe, nothing matters. And actually, it's not until the emergence of creatures to whom things matter that things matter. Now, if you've got a God who likes light, he says it is good. Things matter to that God. That's how that you can get value that way. If God's pleased or displeased, if it matters to God, fine. But if there isn't anything out there, and with a secular worldview, we're not postulating, or at least I'm not. I can't find this God, though I don't preclude. I don't know why the universe is the way it is until life emerges. Then things start making sense to me. But why things are the way they are, how they came into being, I don't have a clue. So, but in terms of what we know, life only exists on this earth. I don't believe that, but I don't know anything about any other planet. And until life exists on this earth, I'm not aware of there being anything to which anything would matter. And things eventually do get to matter, as one of the strategies that life implies is that mattering business, better and worse. All of a sudden, there's value. Value as an emergent thing is the difference between the better and the worse real? Well, the secular worldview that I think needs to be changed would say, well, the fact that the whole species of creatures experience things in terms of this kind of better and this kind of worse, that the experience is merely subjective. Well, there's a lot that's subjective in it, but fundamentally, the better and worse is built into us. I know how to handle a cat. I'm known in my family as a cat whisperer. I'm not great with dogs, but I am good with cats. Anytime I find a cat, I can generally, I know what the basic, how to make friends with a cat. There's an inborn better and worse in cats, and I can, sometimes I need to be able to teach a cat to enjoy doing what I like doing with the cats, like its tail or something like that. But basically, and we're the same way. There are a lot of variation, one individual to another, one culture to another. There's a lot of things that are overlaid over what we get born with, but we do get born with some. The evolutionary perspective says, oh, don't think of that as merely subjective. Oh, please. What's born into us was selected for because it was life-serving. That's not merely subjective. Value can only exist in the experiential dimension, and the experiential dimension is real because it is part of the strategy by which the species lives. Our experience of things in terms of better and worse is simultaneously bringing value into our world as a real thing, because our experience is real. And it's non-random the way it is. I mean, we have idiosyncrasies and we have different cultures, but underneath all that, we're like cats too. We like to get scritched behind the ears. The evolutionary perspective says that if we've got this capacity for a spiritually transformative experience, that wouldn't be there if it hadn't been selected for, and it wouldn't have been selected for if it hadn't led to an increase in our ancestors' ability to get their DNA into the future, which means it's real, it's important, and life-serving. So what we've got is the evolutionary perspective being used to explain the origins of evil as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse. And we've got the evolutionary perspective being used in a different way about what's selected for, not the escape from the evolved order, but in this case, what evolution instills into the nature of the creature that has experiences. And those are two important ways of changing the secular worldview. And out of that combination, we actually can see the reality of two forces that behave very much like good and evil, and actually are battling the creature's civilization over which is going to shape the human world. And right now, some of the battles that we're looking at right now are fascism versus democracy in America, and in a longer term sense, humankind getting its act together to survive for the long haul, which is good, and in harmony with the planet, which is good, and fulfilling to the human beings within it, which is good, or whether we're going to destroy ourselves and take who knows how much of the planet with us, which is not good. It's an ancient battle, and it emerges inevitably, I think, in the world of any creature on any planet that would, I've already indicated why the force of evil would emerge automatically if the creature takes that fateful step onto the path of civilization. That I think can be shown. And I think that any cultural animal will have a moral dimension. I haven't really figured out how inevitable it would be that there would be a spiritual dimension in the inborn capacities of a civilization creating species. It's true of us. That much is clear. But what would be possible? And I mean, if every species is going to be having to deal with bringing that force under control, and having to deal with that destructive force, that force of evil from the beginnings of its civilization, and into the rise of empires and stuff like that. I think that they're going to have a sense of better and worse. It'll be built into but whether they will also have the capacity to get that additional life-serving passion in the direction of the sacred, I don't know. That seems to be part of our arsenal. And I do have an explanation for that. I think that it is at least one way of increasing our orientation toward what's life-serving. And it's also one way of giving us a more passion in our motivation to make the human world better and not let the force of destruction win. But in any event, we humans have at least these couple things going for us that are not merely subjective, that get validation from the fact that they are born into us, even if cultures can take them in all kinds of directions. So that's at least some of that's going to be there, I think, in any civilization creating species, which means that there will be, the evolutionary perspective says there will be a force for the good that's oriented toward fulfillment, and a force for evil that has to do with the inevitable selection for the ways of power, even to a large extent contrary to meeting human needs, of giving human beings what they think of as better. And then in terms of the good, an ally of the good is whatever tools that we may have that can help us order our world well enough and soon enough so that the good and not the evil dictate how the human world is going to unfold. We want to have an understanding of the nature of the battle that we're engaged in, how it can be fought and won, which requires that we utilize the intellect. Because we have created a very challenging situation for ourselves. The question of, how do we create a world where such a thing as a nuclear holocaust, an all-out war between major superpowers with nuclear-armed superpowers? How do you create a world where that kind of nuclear holocaust cannot happen? Our moral passion could say, yeah, that's what we need. Our spiritual passions can tell us, yeah, that's what we need. But we need to use our minds to understand, well, why is it like this right now, and how do we need to get it to be so that isn't going to be a possibility? And what are the steps to take now? These are I don't have any blueprint for how we make sure that the good triumphs over the evil, but I do think I have a way of showing the nature of the battle that will have ramifications for how we fight it and how effectively we are able to have the good prevail over the evil, and have America remain the leader of the free world, for example, which is a good thing. I mean, it's not 100% true, never was, but it is an important truth compared to if we side with, say, Putin's Russia. And I think I can at least point in the direction of how do we need to look at this battle when we're looking at will the human civilization get its act together well enough and soon enough to survive for the long haul and to be in harmony with the biosphere enough for it to be viable for the long haul, or are we going to destroy ourselves through our environmental bull in a china shop ways, like this climate crisis? There are things that it brings into greater focus. But it also, in the meanwhile, tells us that we are better creatures than we thought ourselves to be. By identifying that force, that inevitable empowering of the spirit of the gangster to have a disproportionate say, we realize that, when you look around the world and you see that 4 out of 5 of the people who are having the biggest impact are sociopaths, whatever I said at the beginning. Well, I think it's valuable to understand that what we are given by nature is better than what we think, better than what our culture has thought when it has looked at the human world and inferred that it's a picture of what we are. It isn't a picture of what we are. It's a picture of what inevitably will distort and contort the evolution of a creature's civilization until it brings that force under control. And it encourages the folks with a secular worldview who have, as I can testify from 30 years of conversations with the liberal world, does not sufficiently honor the reality and importance and life-serving nature of our moral and spiritual dimensions. It thinks that what's true is confined to what's objective, and so they rule out looking at the experiential realm as a clue to what it is that we should be aligned with. And so that's another way it can fortify us, this better human story of mine. So I'll close here, I think, and ask you if you're interested to look at my library of videos and look at to subscribe and to tell other people about this if you think that there's something that they would find of interest, and to look at where I lay some of these things out in writing, like the piece that I was reading today, to try to demonstrate the reality of there being a force of evil that can be seen operating in the human world, that inevitably merge with civilization and can be seen operating in the dense network of cause and effect, seen as a force that moves things in the same way as you can see the wind in the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. Thank you very much. I'll be back on Monday, if not before, with another piece of this integrative vision of the human story that I think could be useful in this challenging time. Thanks.